Marcus Antonius, The Last Campaign of Constantine. Fortress of Aurelian, Initiative Warfront, 2144. The wind howled through the marble pillars of the war room, carrying the weight of the desert beyond. Marcus Antonius stood at the edge of the balcony, his gaze locked on the horizon where the faint glow of advancing armies crept like wildfire across the dunes. From this vantage point, NeoAlexandria shimmered faintly in the distance, untouched, yet aware of the storm closing in. Behind him, Constantine paced in calculated silence, fingers brushing across the ancient map laid flat over the command table. The ley lines pulsating across the holographic projection mirrored the flicker in his eyes, brimming with silent confidence. "They gather faster than we expected," Marcus said, not turning away from the sands. "Ramses pushes his legions forward." Constantine's voice was calm, but firm. "Ramses underestimates the initiative. He forgets why I hold this city and why no fortress has fallen beneath our banner in decades." Marcus finally turned, his hand resting on the hilt of his ceremonial blade. "It's not Ramses who concerns me. His armies fight for dominion, but others march for vengeance. The resistance has grown bold." A shadow passed over Constantine's expression. "The resistance exists because we allow it. They do not shape the future. We do." Marcus stepped forward, lowering his voice. "The people speak of cracks in our rule. They see the ley lines flicker. The unrest isn't just on the outskirts anymore. Constantine, we can't keep crushing cities and expect the world to forget." Constantine's gaze hardened. "Have you forgotten your place, Marcus?" The tension in the room coiled like a serpent. For the first time in years, Marcus felt the weight of his title pressing against him, executor of the initiative, commander of the legion. "No, I remember it clearly," Marcus replied. "I have fought your wars. I have spilled blood in your name. But this feels different." Constantine stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "Different how?" Marcus hesitated. The words hung heavy in his throat. Like the end of something. A long silence followed. Constantine's expression softened, but his voice carried the weight of finality. "You're tired, old friend. The battle will pass. We will endure, as we always have." Marcus forced a nod, though the gnawing doubt lingered. Midnight, the eastern gate. The fortress's outer walls stretched for miles beneath the stars, lit by columns of fire and energy barriers. Marcus stood alone at the gate, watching the campfires of Ramses' forward scouts flicker in the valley below. Jonah approached quietly, his footsteps light against the stone. "Marcus." The guards report strange movements along the ley lines. "Scanners are glitching." Marcus frowned. "Glitching?" Jonah nodded. "The kind we saw before Milan fell." Marcus's hand instinctively tightened around the handle of his blade. "Sound the watch. If they breach the outer rings by morning, we're the last line." As Jonah departed, Marcus felt the pull of the ley lines beneath his boots. The earth hummed faintly, as if something ancient stirred beneath the surface. His gaze drifted once more to the stars, but this time, he felt the weight of inevitability settling on his shoulders. By dawn, the siege would begin, and Marcus Antonius would face the first crack in Constantine's empire. The siege breaks, morning light. The first strike came with the rising sun. A deafening crack echoed across the desert as ley line energy arced through the air, shattering portions of the outer barrier. Marcus charged down the stone corridors of the fortress, shouting orders to scrambling soldiers who rushed to fortify the eastern defenses. From the ramparts, Marcus caught sight of Ramses' army, columns of soldiers flanked by towering war machines, their surfaces etched with glowing hieroglyphs pulsing with ancient power. Ramses himself rode at the center, clad in shimmering obsidian armor, his presence magnetic even at this distance. "Focus fire on the siege engines," Marcus barked. "Don't let them breach the second ring." Artillery thundered from the fortress, sending ripples of energy toward the advancing forces. Drones hovered above, casting shields of light, but even their defenses began to waver under the intensity of the assault. Jonah appeared at Marcus's side, panting. "We can hold them, but the ley lines, something's feeding from them. It's like the fortress is bleeding power." Marcus's eyes narrowed. He glanced toward Constantine's tower at the heart of the fortress. The runes along its edges pulsed erratically. Jonah, get to Greta and secure the inner gate. I'll deal with Constantine. Jonah hesitated but obeyed, disappearing down the stairwell. Marcus pressed forward, the weight of responsibility settling heavier with each step. Constantine's chamber. Decision point. Marcus found Constantine in the highest chamber, staring out at the battlefield with an almost serene detachment. The light from the fires below cast long shadows across his face. It's slipping, Constantine. The fortress, everything, it's unraveling, Marcus said, voice rough with frustration. Constantine didn't turn. Let it unravel, Marcus. It is the way of things. Marcus stepped forward, fists clenched. You would let it fall? You've held this empire together for decades, and now you simply let it burn? Constantine's gaze finally met his, calm yet distant. We built this empire on sand, Marcus. And the winds are rising. The two men stared at each other, the weight of years between them. Marcus's grip on his blade tightened, not in anger, but in realization. It's not the world that's failing, Marcus said softly. It's you. Constantine's silence confirmed what Marcus had suspected. The time for loyalty had passed. By nightfall, Marcus Antonius would make his choice. And the path he chose would shape the world to come. Marcus Antonius, The Breaking of the Chain. NeoAlexandria, Initiative Citadel, 2144. A sky heavy with the weight of dying stars stretched over NeoAlexandria, its glow dimmed by the haze of rising smoke. From his vantage atop the citadel's stone steps, Marcus Antonius watched the city below, where veins of flickering ley lines pulsed like strained lifeblood through crumbling districts. The battle at Aurelian was won, but what was left standing might not endure the coming storm. Jonah's approach was silent, but Marcus felt his presence before a word was spoken. The quiet steps of a soldier too accustomed to war. The resistance breached the outer slums, Jonah murmured, his voice low as if the city itself might overhear. Small incursions, but they grow bold. Marcus's grip tightened around the worn hilt of his blade, fingers tracing the pattern of carved symbols etched from years of use. They aren't the only ones. The people know it. Constantine knows it. Jonah's gaze swept the smoke-drenched skyline. And Ramses? Marcus finally turned, his eyes dark beneath the weight of his brow. He smells weakness. And if he acts first, the initiative will not survive him. The inner courtyard. The courtyard below bustled with wounded soldiers and medics moving in the latticework of torchlight and flickering hololamps. Sweat, metal, and the acrid sting of burnt ley lines hung in the air. Greta Heller, clad in her medic's fatigues, directed the flow of bodies with a sharpness Marcus had long admired. She carried no weapon, but few crossed her. Her gaze met his as he descended the stone stairs. There was no greeting, only the blunt efficiency of shared burdens. Rumor says Constantine plans to lock down the slums, Greta said, never breaking stride as she flagged down a passing officer. The entire district. If he does it, the riots will spread by morning. Marcus's expression hardened. That will only hasten the fire. Greta's lips thinned. I know. That's why I called you. Ramses presses from without, but the resistance boils within. If we corner them, they won't burn out, they'll erupt. Marcus stepped beside her, watching the glow of the ley lines beneath their feet. The power coursing through NeoAlexandria felt thinner, stretched taut like a wire ready to snap. Constantine won't stop. He sees rebellion as a plague that must be crushed at the source. Greta's voice dipped just above a whisper. And you? Marcus's hesitation hung between them, the weight of unspoken thoughts echoing louder than words. I still serve. Greta's eyes narrowed, searching his. For how long? It was not an accusation. But it lingered. The lantern chamber. Before Marcus could return to the watchtower, a summons reached him. A message from Cleopatra herself, cryptic but unmistakable. The lantern chamber, an old sector beneath the citadel gardens, whispered with clandestine meetings and shadows of the past. Marcus descended through the narrow stone corridors, the air thick with jasmine and the distant hum of ley line currents. Within the chamber, Cleopatra stood by an ancient fountain, her silhouette framed against the flickering lanterns lining the walls. I thought I'd find you here, Marcus said quietly, stepping into the soft light. Cleopatra's gaze lifted, sharp as the edge of glass. You've always known where to find me, Marcus. The question is, why do you come? Marcus exhaled, letting his hand rest on the pommel of his sword. The city fractures. Constantine's grip tightens, but it slips between his fingers. The resistance grows bolder, and Ramses waits like a vulture. She approached him, her movements fluid and deliberate. I've felt the shift in the air. The slums burn brighter each night, and the people no longer whisper in fear, they shout. Her eyes searched his, deep and unrelenting. And what of you? Do you stand by his side while the empire collapses, or do you step away from the chain? Marcus hesitated. I still have obligations. Cleopatra smiled faintly, brushing her hand against the ancient stone of the chamber wall. Obligations. Such a convenient word for shackles. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of years pressing down on both of them. She broke the quiet first. You've known this path was coming, Marcus. The longer you wait, the more you become the chain that binds you. Ramses senses weakness in Constantine, but so does the resistance. Marcus turned to face her fully. What would you have me do? Cleopatra's gaze sharpened, her voice dropping low. Decide. Before someone else decides for you. As Marcus left the chamber, her words echoed in his mind. The weight of the empire hung heavier than ever, but something else stirred beneath it, the faint ember of something freer, wilder. The threshold of choice awaited him, and Marcus Antonius was already crossing it. Marcus Antonius, Shadows of Alexandria. NeoAlexandria, the Old District, 2144. NeoAlexandria whispered at night, her breath curling through the narrow streets, wrapping Marcus Antonius in the silk of memories too stubborn to fade. The city stretched before him like an ancient lover, familiar but changed, its heartbeat a fractured echo beneath the weight of flickering ley lines. Marcus walked alone beneath the pale gaze of the moon, his footsteps muffled by the heavy hush of the old district. The air was thick with the incense of distant altars, tangled with the smoke of fires that smoldered unseen. The weight of centuries pressed upon these streets, the ghosts of emperors and rebels alike etched into the stone. But it was not the city's ghosts that haunted him. It was her, Cleopatra. Her name drifted on the edges of thought, as inevitable as the tide. Marcus's gloved hand traced the cracks along the ancient walls, his fingertips brushing faint carvings of serpents entwined with falcons. Her symbols. Time had worn them, but not enough to erase her mark. It never could. Years earlier, the Garden of Lanterns. The garden lay bathed in warm lantern light, a constellation of gold drifting lazily above stone pathways. Olive trees swayed with the evening breeze, their branches whispering softly overhead. Marcus remembered the first time he saw her there, how the world had seemed to pause, as if the very stars held their breath. She sat at the edge of the fountain, legs tucked beneath her, fingers trailing through the water as though stirring the sky's reflection. You watch from the shadows, she had said without turning. Marcus smiled faintly, stepping into the lantern's glow. A soldier's habit. Cleopatra looked up then, her gaze locking with his in that way she did, slow, deliberate, like peeling back layers of armor no one else could touch, or a man's. Her lips curled at the edges, though the weight of her gaze softened the jest. You always notice me, Marcus replied, leaning against the marble rail. I always will. The Old District, present day. Marcus slowed as he passed beneath the flickering neon of the market square, the light pooling like dying embers. The hum of quiet voices and distant trade filled the air, but it all felt distant, drowned beneath the pull of a narrow alley ahead. There, by the fountain that still trickled beneath the weight of centuries, her memory stood waiting. Memory, the alley of kings. She stood beside him, wrapped in the soft folds of midnight blue, her hands gliding over the stone as though feeling for something hidden beneath the surface. Do you know why they call this the Alley of Kings? Cleopatra's voice was low, as if the city itself might hear. Marcus leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Because every ruler passes through, drunk on their own ambition? She laughed softly, her head tilting just enough for the moonlight to catch the curve of her smile. No. Because every king leaves something behind here. Some carve their name in stone, others in blood. But the ones who matter, her fingers stilled along the carved wing of a falcon, leave nothing at all. Only whispers. Marcus stepped closer, reaching to brush a stray curl from her face. His touch lingered, as if drawn to her by forces older than them both. And which will I be? Her gaze, unflinching, pierced through him. That depends, she whispered. Will you forever follow Constantine, or will you become something more? Her hand slipped into his, cool and certain. The weight of her words settled like iron between them. The old district, present day. Marcus stood before the fountain now, staring at the faint reflection that blinked back at him from the rippling water. The years had aged him, but the question she asked still hovered, unanswered. Empires rise and fall, Marcus, her voice echoed in the stillness. But we are more than empires. The calm in his ear crackled to life. Jonah's voice, brisk and clipped, shattered the silence. Resistance forces moving in the northern quarter. Fire spreading. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, letting the echoes of the past linger a moment longer. I'll handle it, he replied. But as he turned, his gaze flicked once more to the empty alley, half expecting to see her standing there. The shadows remained undisturbed. Yet somehow, Marcus felt as though Cleopatra's eyes were still on him, watching, waiting. As Marcus strode into the growing flames of the northern quarter, her memory followed. And he wondered, would he leave behind stone, blood, or whispers? Marcus Antonius, Fire Beneath the Moon. NeoAlexandria, Northern Quarter, 2144. The northern quarter smoldered beneath the weight of conflict, the streets illuminated by the soft glow of burning structures that lined the skyline like torches of rebellion. Marcus Antonius moved through the alleyways with the quiet resolve of a shadow, his cloak sweeping against the cobblestones. The air vibrated with tension, but beneath it all, the city breathed the same as it had centuries before, ageless, eternal. The fires whispered of unrest, but Marcus's mind lingered elsewhere. His grip tightened around the hilt of his sword as he pressed forward, eyes flicking across the crumbling walls, half expecting to see her shape slip through the smoke. She was everywhere here. Memory, the docks of Alexandria. The sea had lapped against the wooden piers like a lover's kiss, gentle and persistent, as Cleopatra walked beside him. The linen of her robe brushed against his arm, her head tilted just enough to let the setting sun dance along the line of her jaw. You can't stay forever, Marcus had said, his voice nearly drowned by the waves. She had smiled without looking at him. Forever isn't ours to hold. But I would try, Marcus replied, his gaze drifting to the golden horizon, where the sails of distant ships caught the fading light. Cleopatra stopped, turning to face him fully. Her hand lifted, fingers grazing his cheek with a softness he could still feel. That's what I fear most. Present day, northern quarter. A scream pierced the air, distant but sharp. Marcus blinked, the echo of Cleopatra's touch dissolving into the haze of the present. He pressed forward, stepping over the fractured remains of a fallen drone, its circuits still flickering weakly in protest. Jonah's voice broke over the calm, Sector 6 secure. We're holding the perimeter, but the resistance is digging in. They won't go quietly. Let them dig, Marcus said, his tone flat. Just make sure they don't bury themselves. Jonah hesitated. You sure about this? Constantine's orders are clear, no quarter. Marcus's grip tightened. Leave that to me. Memory, the royal chamber. It had been late, the silk canopy of Cleopatra's chamber stirring faintly as she reclined against the cushions. Marcus stood at the edge of the balcony, staring out across the city bathed in moonlight. You're restless, she observed. He sighed, turning to her. I'm loyal. Loyalty isn't restlessness, Marcus. Cleopatra's voice was soft, but the weight behind it carried centuries of wisdom. It's doubt disguised as duty. He approached her, the distance between them evaporating like mist. What would you have me do? Cleopatra's eyes met his, steady as the stars overhead. Be more than Constantine's shadow. Present day, fire in the streets. The northern gate loomed ahead, flames licking at its edges as resistance fighters scrambled behind makeshift barricades. Marcus paused, lifting his head as the wind shifted. A figure stepped from the smoke, hooded but unmistakable. She was there. Not Cleopatra, but someone who wore her likeness like an echo. A descendant, perhaps, or merely another illusion crafted by the city's ghosts. Marcus lowered his sword, uncertain for the first time in years. Who are you? He called out, his voice steady despite the tumult of his heart. The figure stepped closer, the flicker of the flames reflecting in her eyes. Someone who remembers, she replied. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. Some memories refused to stay buried. Marcus Antonius, the reign of ghosts. NeoAlexandria, the Harbor of Kings, 2147. The harbor lay wrapped in silver light, the water's surface a reflection of the sky's endless expanse. Marcus Antonius stood at the water's edge, his silhouette framed by the flicker of torchlight and the soft hum of ships swaying in their moorings. The world around him had changed, yet the sea, eternal and indifferent, remained the same. She approached quietly, as she always did, moving through the night like a breath of warm wind, carrying with her the scent of ancient incense and something else, something uniquely hers. "Cleopatra, you've grown reflective," she said softly, stepping beside him. Her eyes, dark and luminous, mirrored the stars overhead. "That is either dangerous or a sign that you're finally coming to your senses." Marcus let out a quiet laugh, though it carried little weight. "You think I've been senseless all this time?" "I think," Cleopatra replied, tilting her head toward him, "you have been many things. But rarely honest with yourself." Marcus's gaze remained fixed on the sea, as if the answer lay somewhere beyond the horizon. "I was honest enough to stay." "Were you?" she asked, her voice dipping just above a whisper. "Or did duty simply hold you in place?" His eyes flicked to her then, catching the flicker of something unreadable in her expression. Time had tempered Cleopatra, but it had not softened her. She wore the years like armor, beautiful and unrelenting. The waves lapped gently against the dock, filling the silence between them. The wind tugged faintly at Cleopatra's hair, loose tendrils swaying like silk threads against the moonlight. Marcus found himself studying her in the same way he had in the early years, when every glance felt like a question he could never fully answer. "You stood at my side when the world fractured," Marcus said, his voice low. "When Constantine's empire burned, and the ashes fell over Alexandria. You could have walked away." Cleopatra's eyes softened, though her posture remained composed. "And leave you alone to rebuild a world you never wanted to hold?" "No, Marcus. I'm as much a part of this city as you are." He turned to face her more fully, stepping closer. The distant hum of the ships fell away, leaving only the rhythm of their breaths mingling in the cool night air. "It feels as though we've been standing at the edge of this moment for years," Marcus admitted. "Always moving forward, but never stepping across the line." Cleopatra arched a brow, her lips curving with the faintest trace of amusement. "Perhaps we feared what lay on the other side." Marcus shook his head. "Not fear. Just uncertainty. Constantine's shadow loomed over us both for too long. Now, I think." He paused, his hand lifting to brush against the curve of her shoulder. "I think it's gone." Cleopatra's fingers trailed along his wrist, a gesture so familiar yet charged with unspoken promises. Her touch lingered, grounding them in the present. "Constantine was a force, but not a destiny. You and I have always been something apart from him, Marcus. We just didn't name it." Marcus smiled softly, his hand settling at the small of her back, drawing her closer until the space between them disappeared entirely. "Then let's name it now." The words hung there, suspended between them, fragile as glass and twice as precious. Cleopatra's gaze searched his face, and in that moment, the weight of the past seemed to lift. The harbor, the wars, the crowns, all of it faded into the distance. "Marcus," she whispered, his name curling softly around the edge of her lips. "You never had to hold the world alone." Their foreheads touched, and for a breathless eternity, the universe shrank to the warmth shared between them. The faint breeze carried the scent of salt and flowers from distant gardens, wrapping them in a cocoon of silence. Marcus pressed a soft kiss to her brow, his hand threading gently through her hair. "We build it together, then. No shadows. Just us." Cleopatra smiled, truly smiled, as if for the first time in years. "Just us," she repeated, her voice a vow that the stars themselves seemed to hear. As they stood entwined beneath the canopy of night, Marcus felt the weight of the past dissolve into the ripples of the harbor, replaced by the steady heartbeat of the future they would shape together. The silence stretched between them, but there was comfort in it now. Marcus traced slow circles along Cleopatra's back, grounding himself in the small but significant act. "Do you regret it?" he asked after a long pause. "All the years we spent wrapped in politics instead of this?" Cleopatra exhaled softly, her cheek resting against his shoulder. "I regret nothing but the moments we let slip through our fingers." She leaned back just enough to meet his gaze. But the past is unchangeable, Marcus. What matters is now. And now, I choose this. He kissed her softly, lingering as if to ensure she wouldn't disappear, that this was not another fleeting illusion conjured by his heart. When they parted, the fire burning behind her eyes reassured him. She was here. This was real. Then we begin again, Marcus said, his voice steady. Together. They turned back toward the harbor, watching as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. Ships bobbed gently against the current, waiting for winds to carry them forward. In the quiet of the harbor, Marcus knew that whatever came next, they would face it side by side. Marcus Antonius, beneath the crimson sky. NeoAlexandria, the Royal Promenade, 2147. The dawn stretched lazily over NeoAlexandria, its first light spilling across marble facades and winding streets that carried the weight of centuries. Marcus Antonius and Cleopatra walked in silence along the Royal Promenade, where the echoes of old empires clung to every stone. The city, bruised but not broken, stirred beneath the soft hum of a new beginning. The promenade had once been the site of Constantine's grand parades, a corridor of power lined with statues of forgotten kings and conquerors. Now, the statues watched two figures walking side by side, neither adorned in ceremonial garb nor cloaked in the trappings of rulership. Marcus's hand lingered at Cleopatra's lower back, a steady, grounding presence as they moved forward. He could feel the warmth of her through the thin silk of her cloak, and he wondered, not for the first time, how many of the city's rulers had ever walked this path without the weight of armor between them. Do you think they'll accept it? Marcus's voice broke the stillness. His eyes traced the faint cracks in the promenade stones, remnants of the battles fought to secure the fragile peace. Cleopatra's gaze followed his, but her expression remained unreadable. Accept what? That two people can lead without wearing crowns heavy enough to break them? She glanced sideways at him, the corner of her mouth lifting in quiet amusement. Or that we have no intention of rebuilding the world as it was? Marcus exhaled slowly. Both. She stopped, turning to face him beneath the shadow of a towering marble statue. The carved likeness of Constantine loomed above them, though time and war had left its features softened and indistinct. Cleopatra's fingers brushed along Marcus's jaw, lifting his gaze to meet hers. This city isn't stone, Marcus. It's the people. They follow those who understand their struggles, not those who wear crowns. His hand covered hers, holding it against his face for a moment longer. And yet, the people love stories of kings and queens. They look for legends. Cleopatra smiled faintly, her eyes gleaming with mischief. Then let them have stories. Let them write songs of Marcus and Cleopatra, the rulers who held no thrones but shaped the city with their hands and hearts. The words lingered in the air between them, heavy with the weight of what might come. Marcus knew the city's scars ran deep, and peace was not a certainty. But standing beneath the waning shadow of old statues, he felt, for the first time, that the path forward belonged to them, not to ghosts of fallen empires. They continued walking, the faint strains of music rising from distant markets as NeoAlexandria stirred fully to life. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows behind them, and Marcus allowed himself to imagine a future where the weight of the past did not dictate their steps. Let them write their songs, Marcus said, his voice softer now. But let the truth be ours alone. Cleopatra slipped her arm through his, leaning into him as they walked. Agreed. As they stepped beyond the promenade, the statues of kings faded behind them, and the city opened wide with possibilities. The dawn followed in their wake, and with it, the promise of something new. Together, they walked not as rulers bound by fate, but as two souls who had chosen each other beneath the crimson sky.